Ah,
Good morning, sir.
I can see and hear you simultaneously.
I know we're getting better at this every time.
Well,
10 tries, and we finally started figuring it out.
we're just more fault tolerant.
I like your shirt.
Thanks. It's from a company called The Bitter Southerner. They have some. I got another one that says "Make more biscuits."
Yep.
But they're interesting. You got to check their website out. The Bitter Southerner. They've got some interesting, a lot of reading material. They put out books and shirts and sort of, you know, the sort of the more enlightened side of the Southern, the duality of the Southern thing, as the drive-by truckers call it. So yeah, so check them out sometime.
Will do. Man, we're installing. Everything is just going in, and it's like truck after truck going out of here. I've got a mountain of drawers back here behind me that go today.
Yeah.
You know, we made those about a month ago, and they've been sort of kicking around. They got glued up, and then they sat around for a while, and they got sanded, and they got, you know, so anyway, they've finally done their big cleanup on the job site. And so it's time to start putting the fit and trim in. So we've started installing cabinet doors, and now it's time for drawers and drawer faces and all that stuff.
They're all done drilling holes through things and all, so you don't have to worry about the electrician drilling a hole through your drawers to run.
I didn't say that. I just didn't say that at all.
No, that's a perpetual construction job site thing, you know, or the, you know,
it really is.
You want to put a half-inch piece of copper line through, drill a 3-inch hole. You know, it's a
right through a cabinet, and then they point at you and say, "You need to fix that."
Sure, yeah. You got some putty?
What is it? Caulk and paint make a carpenter what he ain't.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about the internet is that you can, people collate those pictures of, you know, crown molding that like misses by an inch on either side, and one's upside down, and it's just caulked in, and you can see some amazing stuff. You can get caught, you can fall down that wormhole of internet sort of photographic memes of screw ups and bad work.
And some of it, you know, is staged just for humor.
Like nobody.
I mean, there's one that's circulated around several times that's, you know, it's like a door jamb, and the molding breaks around it. It's like 20 pieces of molding or something.
Yeah, it's like
it tries to follow every single little angle. It's the most ridiculous looking thing. You know, if it's real, it just makes it that much worse. If it's fake, you know, that's an awful lot of time for a cheap laugh.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's some architectural versions of that.
So what about you? What are you up to?
I went away for about 2 weeks, which was nice. Took the camper out and got some. It was hot. I hadn't been out of the shop in a while, and so we figured taking the camper was kind of a nice socially distant way to spend a little time. So went to the beach, wandered around a bit, and got a little bit of work done. I had a bunch of reading I need to catch up with that I don't really ever get a chance to do. So that was fun.
Yeah. Are you still posting on Medium? I have not looked in quite a while.
A little bit. I've been neglecting that. I got sort of wrapped up in doing video stuff after the COVID, and so I've been doing so
much to manage when you take on all these different things. It just, I mean, it'll eat up your whole life.
I know everything seems like it's such a good idea if it's in the distance. You know, something in the future, it's like, oh yeah, I'll be glad to do that. You know,
right?
You know, I got tons of time to do that. It won't take long. And then all of a sudden, it's just day and night. It's like, oh my gosh, what was I thinking?
Well, I haven't checked it in quite a while. I thought about that yesterday.
You haven't missed anything recently. Okay. It's been probably 2 months or so.
Yeah. All right.
But I need to get back on that because that's kind of fun. You know, sort of reminiscing through old projects and stuff like that.
I enjoy being able to read through some of that stuff. You get into things that, you know, aren't going to be talked about in classes, and, you know, I mean, it's just interesting, and it's kind of archival way that I can, you know, when I have questions, I can go back and look at it. There's some interesting things, interesting archaeology about Bill in there.
Yeah. I try not to talk about things that shouldn't be talked about in public, but I do. It is an interesting. It's a neat. It's nice to be able to sort of. I'll try to walk that line between sort of the being a ShopBot guy and being just the guy that works in the shop.
Right.
And it's, there are lots of times when a hammer is the perfect tool for the job. Nothing digital at all. You just got to grab a block plane and ease the corner, or pick up the track saw or whatever, and just cut the thing up.
It's the funniest thing in the world when Scott sees me pull something off of the ShopBot and it just has these razor sharp corners on it, and I take a hand plane and run it across it. He just thinks that's the funniest thing.
Yeah, it's the hammer that fits your hand.
It's the fastest way. I mean, it fits in the palm, and you just go zip zip, and it's done. There's no setup. There's no tooling. Takes 2 seconds.
There are people that spend hours and hours trying to do a round over while the part's on the tool, and they'll change bits, and it's always, the material's not held down perfectly. It's varying in thickness, and they end up with that little ridge that you get if it's cutting too deep. And it's going to spend hours. And, a hand router and a round over bit is really fast, or a round over bit in a router table. I mean, you can do it.
In a router table, you just push it up against the fence and run it through over and over and over, just as fast as you can go.
It's just done.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's sometimes, sometimes the fancy way is not the best way. Sometimes, and lots of times, the simpler is better.
Simpler is better.
It's really true in most things in life. Complication isn't always an improvement. Sometimes it's just more complicated.
Well, listen, I wanted to talk to you about offsets. You and I've gone through offsets a couple of times, I think, in the past. But I've got another question from one of our viewers, if you can
multitude of viewers.
Yeah, our two viewers. He asked, what is the purpose of setting up offsets? Why do you do it? How do you do it? And where do you do it? When do you do it?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. So one of the first set of offsets that you'll interact with if you're using, the canned routines, the zeroing routines and all that, is there's proc switches, and then there's offset values that save the distance between hitting the proc switch and hitting where 0, 0 is. What's that distance? So that when it hits the switch, it knows how far to move to the corner. And they're saved in the My Variables file. And they're just a value that's unique to your tool. If you change things around and move the stops and all, it would change a little bit. If you change your spool board and want to, make it a different size.
Bill, how do you find it? How do you find the My Variables file?
So it's just a text file, and it's on your computer on the C drive, in SB parts folder, and then in a custom folder. And it's called myvariables.sbc. You can open it up in an editor, in the ShopBot editor or Notepad or anything. And each variable name, and it's got a bunch of them, like the thickness of your Z0 plate. So if you get a different Z0 plate, you decide you want a piece of 1/4-inch aluminum or something, you can change that value in there.
Gotcha.
And you can they're all sort of verbose names. So they all have an ampersand in front, the name of the variable. And then, it could say X-axis proc switch offset. I tried to make the names long enough and verbose enough so they're sort of, so you can go in there and be sort of a,
find them.
You can root through there and find, and you can just change the number in there. And that's loaded every time a ShopBot file is loaded. Every time the ShopBot software is started, that's loaded. So if you make a change, you have to restart the ShopBot software, and it's reloaded there. And all those values are saved in memory and can be used by any routine anytime you run it.
Now, does that stay permanently in the My Variables? So when you set that offset up, you need to remember that for every function after.
Right.
So if it's temporary, you'll want to go back and change that back eventually.
Right. And that's something you really don't want to be. That's sort of those are things that are specific to your tool. There's some settings that are just, that are universal, but those are specific to yours. If because that's going to be a unique value based on your tool. And you can put things in there like your name, and you can have that written into a file. You can do all kinds of stuff. The idea is it's sort of it's also where if you have two z-axes, we were talking about having multiple z-axes. That's where the distance between the centers in X and Y is stored. There's a value in there.
Yep.
And that's read by a file. And all that offset is calculated within a part file, but it's stored within that value. Okay. You can also change that using, there's a ShopBot setup program in the custom tool, in the tools menu, the virtual tool menu. And it's basically just a front end for that file. And it loads that file, and you can make a change in there, and it writes it. So you don't have to open up a notepad and all. You can make the change within the setup program. And, it asks you, this is so old that it asks you if you have proc switches. Because a lot, the older tools just didn't have it. That's a relatively new, that benefits you kids. Us old guys, we had to do it the hard way. But yes, you can use the setup program and change all those values and never look at this thing. But it's underlying it all is this file called My Variables. And it is not touched when the ShopBot software is reinstalled. It stays. It's something that we don't tamper with.
Gotcha.
So it is yours. It's once you make a change in there, we don't mess with it.
Right. So when do you use an offset? What's the purpose for using it? I have my set of ideas, but I was thinking it would be better answered by you. So I'm going to sort of prod you through some of the parts of this question that I got.
Good. So there's a couple ways. So let's say you got just a board stuck in the middle of the table somewhere, and you don't know quite where it is. So you couldn't really draw a sheet of plywood, find this odd shaped board, stick it in there accurately in your drawing, and then toolpath your name in the middle of it. It would just be really hard. You have to do a lot of measuring. You have to worry about all this kind of stuff. So what you can do, there's an offset mode. There's a 2D and a 3D offset mode in the ShopBot software. So you could move to the corner of that piece where you create the file as if it's right at the corner of 0, 0 in VCarve. So it's down here in the home position. Right. You can move the tool to the corner of that where the actual piece is and re-zero there. Manually, just type Z2 there.
Yep.
So that becomes your new 0, 0 location. And then you could, just run the file there. The problem with that is once you start zeroing all over the place, you sort of you've lost your home. The tool hasn't lost where 0, 0 is. It still keeps track, and it knows what all those re-zeros amount to. But you've sort of lost where your corner is. If you want to go back to something there, you've got to rehome and do all this stuff.
Right.
So instead of zeroing there, actually changing your X and Y 0, you can move to that position and then run the file in 2D offset mode. And it's just an option in the fill-in sheet. And what that does is tell you that corner where you are right now, it can be 28.7 and 19.3 in real world coordinates. That temporarily is going to be considered 0, 0. And the file is going to be run as if that's 0, 0. And it'll just run along and it'll do its business. And at the end, it goes back to where it really is.
It should go back to the actual home position.
Right. So if it's supposed to go to 0, 0, in that scenario, it goes all the way back to 0, 0.
Gotcha. Yep.
You've re-zeroed at the corner. When it goes back to 0, 0, it goes back up.
Which is the offset.
Right. Right.
That corner is the offset. So you're telling it to cut this path, you want to go from here and start here, do whatever you have to do, and then at the end of the file, it's going to lift up and come all the way back home.
All the way, it's going to come back to the real 0, 0.
And you have to set that offset for each individual file that you're running if you were running multiple files from the same place.
Right, right. So you could do, well, you could just manually move around. It doesn't matter. You never really set it. You're never changing any of your X or Y values. You're just moving to a new location. And you can, if you wanted to do if you want to sort of rough cut I'm doing these number things for boat numbers, registration numbers. And I got to do 13 sets of them.
Right.
Cutting them out of plastic and engraving the things. So you could, I kind of drew that out as a loop. But if you, you could do the first one, just with the keypad, move it down so it's out of the way.
Right.
Do the second one in the pair in offset mode, and you don't have to know where, as long as you've moved it beyond where the last one stopped, and you know you're clear, you could just keep running it. You can keep moving it all over the table, running it in offset mode, as long as your start point, as long as the point where you want to start the file is clear and it's not going to cut through something else. You can do that all day long and never know a location. You can just keep moving around the table.
But how do you determine what your offset is?
It doesn't care. It doesn't know. You just want to make sure you're just moving the start position around.
Oh, I understand what you're saying. So you're taking the bit to the corner of the material and you're calling it arbitrarily, this is the new
just
location.
Run it from here.
It doesn't matter what that
matter.
number is.
It doesn't matter.
Okay. I got you.
Without offset, you would have to know where that location,
where that was.
Zero at every one of those points. Your new XY0 would be 0, 0 at the start of every one of those. And you would basically lose where everything is. If you wanted to go back.
And that's like what we do when we use the HandyBot with the rotary axis, when we manually move it over above the material, use a little sheet of paper to sort of find that, that zero spot.
Yep.
That's exactly what we're doing.
Yep.
It's just a little different operation in fab mode than in ShopBot SP3. Right?
And now the applying the offsets, the way the my variables file does it and the proc switches do it is handy in something like a desktop or a Max, where you want to run up against the stop somewhere. And I usually run up against the far end, so it's closest to the motor.
Yep.
And then I zero there, and then I know the distance to the corner. So I'm actually, my offsets are real weird for the desktop because I'm moving backwards. But I know that, it's like move back 34.5 inches.
Yep.
So it's, and those guys, and it doesn't have to be done in the My Variables. You can just write that down on a notepad, on a Post-it note, and say, hit the stop and move back here and then re-zero.
So give me an example of when you would go to the My Variables file to change that position versus opening ShopBot 3 and just going into offset mode.
You don't want to change the My Variables file any more than you have to, because it's so universal and it's easy to forget. You make a change for a couple of days, you're better off making the change. If you put so let's say you have your table set up and you have your My Variables, so you got 0, 0 just at the corner of your table. And then you screw a couple of fences down because you want to engrave the job site name on all the drawer fronts, and they're all the same size. You want to set up a little jig there. At the beginning of the day, you would run your C3, get the 0, and then you know that the new corner is, 1.5 inches over and 1.5 inches up. So you could say M2 1.5, 1.5, and then Z2 to 0 there, because you're going to use that as your temporary 0 all day long. But you're not going to use it for the rest of your life. So you don't have to, so then in a situation like that, you're really cutting in the same place over and over, and you're just going to swap out blanks and carve something in it. And you just want to have a registration point. Then that's something you would do with Notepad, and you just remember 1.5 inches over, 1.5 inches up is my new 0, 0 position for this particular run of jobs.
So if you're doing that, then when you go to VCarve to create that file, do you have to use the offset in VCarve when you set up your file?
You could.
Or is it independent? If you're using the offset in ShopBot, it's automatically going to go to that point as your start point.
You can't do both. Well, you can't. You'll get screwed up if you do both. So what you want to, you can either do it the way I said. You just move over 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches,
right,
and then re-zero there. Or you can move over 1.5 inches, run it in offset mode there. So there's lots of ways to skin this cat.
Right.
In V-carve, you could also just draw those two fences.
Yep.
As just little rectangles, and then or you can just set the corner of your blank to be over. You can sort of pick where location is, that sort of center in the four corners. You can set that lower left corner to 1.5 and 1.5.
So, I did that on a couple of parts when I made that parts holding jig a couple of months ago, and I ran into some very minor accuracy issues with offset in V-carve versus what it was actually doing on the table. Now it was so minuscule that it really didn't matter for what I was doing. But I tried to run, after I finished that batch of parts that were kind of non-critical, it didn't, if it's off a 1/16 of an inch at the most, it's really not that big of a deal because it just sets the whole thing off 1/16 of an inch, right?
Yeah, 1/16 is a sizable error.
Well, it is. But I'm saying I don't think it was off that much. I'm saying just as a sort of a point of argument here, it was off. I don't know. I mean, it was probably off a 1/64 of an inch. But if you multiply that by any factor of parts,
right,
that grows really fast,
yeah.
Right? So the first batch of parts that I was cutting were all flat and on sheet goods, and it really didn't matter because I had, added enough waste on the end that didn't account for anything. The thing was that when I put the jig on the table, I cut the fences on the jig with the tool.
Right.
Right? And so that told me where the fences were. Right? Logically.
Yep.
When I put the parts in, I found there was this minor discrepancy, and I think that I was maybe not putting enough decimal places into the ShopBot offset or the V-carve offset parameters. So it'll give you like decimal in 3 or 4 places after that. To say that my offset is this much. And I think my mistake was that I was putting in, like 0.019 instead of 0.1093 or whatever it was that I needed. I think I was leaving off that last decimal place unintentionally. Yeah. And I think that compounded over, and that was kind of frustrating. And it made me wonder, if you had critical parts, really critical parts, how do you really dial in that accuracy? Is it better to do it in ShopBot or is it better to do it in V-carve? And then how many decimal places do you put in when you're doing that? So if you're doing like table joinery and you have a part that needs to, say, slide into another part, it needs to be dead on. How much do you cut that over? That part, it has to be slightly larger than the mating part, or it won't slide on.
Yeah. Or if it slides on.
How much is that, and where would you do that?
So there's a couple of ways. One is just draw it with a little bit of slop in it. So to get that, so assuming that your humming routines are dead on, and it always goes back to the same location from the proc switches. Right. Excuse me. And they could be
which I think after a year we've finally gotten dialed in.
You have to be a little bit careful. The distance from the proc switch to the head of the bolt, if it's too far, you can get a little variation. There's sort of a sweet spot in there. And which way that bolt is, it's a hex bolt. If it's cockeyed a little bit, so you're sort of hitting partially hitting the point and partially hitting the flat. So it's there's a little monkeying to do with getting that just right. But assuming that's dialed in and you're accurately going to the same 0-0 position. And you can test that. You can run the proc switch a bunch of times with a pointy V bit and, you know, make sure it's always going to the same place.
Right.
I do 3 decimal places. I think anything more than that is just, you know, you're fooling yourself.
Well, so that's what I had sort of subscribed to, was 3 decimal places. So
I mean, that's,
what I theorized what was getting that off. So I cut a bunch of sample joints for some of this furniture.
mm-hmm.
You know, the joinery has to be dead on. It's either dead on or it's off. I mean, It's just that simple.
Yeah, it's pretty binary.
It really is. And what I found was that it's, you know, when I would fit the parts together, they would go together fine. And, you know, if I didn't care, like I think a lot of people don't, you know, I could have put glue in it and said, that's a day, that's a wrap. And if there's a 32nd of an inch slop in the gap or whatever, you know, whatever, glue will fill that up. And that's okay, except that when you're doing stuff at a, you know, on a big project like this, and you're trying to make an impression on them at, you know, at how good you are at what you do, you want to take that stuff really seriously, and you want to find that sweet spot where it's dialed in, and you're not making, in your own mind, you're not making excuses. I mean, frankly, the folks hiring you for the job probably wouldn't care and wouldn't notice.
Wouldn't know, yeah.
But you would.
Yeah.
And, you know, if I build something, I sort of take the assumption that there might be a Bill Young in that room that takes a look and goes, yeah, that's all right. You know,
look at all that putty.
We can dial that in a little tighter than that. You know, and the truth of the matter is, like the folks that I'm working for right now, a couple of their top people have been taking classes from me for several years. And so they're really expecting, you know, quite a show here.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is why it matters to me. You know, I mean, these are woodworkers. They're serious guys. They're building, you know, multifamily, big multi-million-dollar projects. You know, I mean, they're hiring the guy that teaches them how to do stuff, to build things. You want to show off a little bit about how good you are with it. You know.
They got pretty high expectations.
Well, it really does, and a lot of that is self-imposed. I mean, I think I'm making more out of something than I would have to. But at the same time, if I'm going to teach ShopBot to other people, I want to be able to know how to dial those things in at that accuracy level that I'm seeking.
Yeah,
you know,
that's
and not sort of say good enough is good enough, but say, you know, right on the money is where you want to be, and the tool is capable of that. You know, if I'm using, for example, if I'm using a table saw or something, then I'll accept a certain level of discrepancy in something. You know, I mean, because your miter gauge may not be perfectly square. It could be as square as you can get it, but it's still not perfectly square. Or the blade, you know, when you raise and lower a table saw blade, it's just a fundamentally inaccurate thing.
Sure.
So you may have a tiny little bit of slop in a joint or something that you know, that's one of those moments where you say, okay, there's a certain level of what I'll accept here. But on a CNC machine, you want it to be right on.
Yeah,
I do.
Yeah. So
and I'm wondering. Go back to the origin of my question. I'm wondering if it's a better practice to just pick one or the other with ShopBot for offset mode, my variables, or VCarve for offset. Do you have a go-to? Do you have a preference?
It should, in theory, all give you the same results. In theory.
Okay.
There's no reason that I can think of that it would be.
What about a practice?
Well, see, the thing that I would check, assuming that your proc switches are set and you have an accurate 0-0 to start with,
right?
Then I would be suspect that there's still a little slop somewhere in the setup, and sort of where you'll see that is in direction change.
In the physical machine.
Yeah, I mean, the way to do that is to power it up and just shake the hell out of it.
Yeah.
See if, you know, the pinion gears get worn after a while. It doesn't take too many. You've been running it pretty hard.
Yeah, I have.
I would double check that and just see, because you would.
Well, I've gotten into the habit of giving it the Bill shake
Yeah.
test. I just kind of grab the gantry and
everything
I do this with it, you know, and I sort of tug on the Z a little bit just to make sure that before I start a session, nothing's weird. Because if you remember, we did lose home
Yeah.
earlier in this job, and it significantly impacted what I was doing. I had to remake a bunch of parts, which I don't like doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just got into the habit, you know, like you recommended, just to grab it and just give it a tug and just say, hey,
It is.
good morning, old bones. You know?
Well, I mean, that's because it's so, you know, these pinion gears do a lot of work, you know, and the pinion gear is designed to be consumable. Because it's so so much easier to replace a pinion gear than to replace all that rack along there. So it's designed that's the thing that gets eaten up after a while.
Right.
And people tend to sort of ignore them. And we get pictures of people, and they're just, you know, they're almost like cylinders.
Well, and then, you know, the other thing is when we started doing these videos, it was freezing cold in here.
Yeah.
And now it's 120 degrees in the shop sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that has to be affecting some of it.
Yep. There's variation in all of that. Grease gets cold. And,
so what I've started doing is just, you know, I run the zero routines every time, and I just out of caution, I guess, when I'm changing sheets and things like that, I just go ahead and zero the X and Y and the Z each time. And I don't know if I need to do that or not, but I've just developed it as a habit.
It doesn't hurt, and it's better to have a habit than to sort of occasionally do it.
Right.
Habits are good for old folks. You know, once you get that muscle memory of hitting those buttons. I'm not implying that you're nearly as old as me, but that it's good. Consistency is good.
Are you saying I'm not a spring chicken anymore?
Well, no, you're somewhere on the spectrum. We'll put it that way.
Somewhere on some kind of spectrum.
We'll see.
Well, Bill, I mean that helps. I still, at some point when this whole thing is over, I really want to get you down here and just have you go through the machine and say, you know, here's why this is doing whatever. I mean, I feel like we've got it dialed in pretty well, but I still find these moments where, you know, I'll tell it to go somewhere with the VCarve file, and I swear to you, it's off just a hair. I mean, here lately it's been fine. So can you? There have been different points in this project where I've found something is out.
So if you tell it to go to, so in the VCarve file, you're drawing, you know, you're offsetting it a little bit, doing all that business, and then you know you got a hole somewhere, and you can find its location in the VCarve drawing.
Right.
If you tell the tool to go there with a command, you know, with M2, you know, whatever, 16.375, 25.863, does the bit drop into the hole? Does it go the same place?
You know, I haven't tried that, but I would say, yeah, I would say it does at this point.
You think it's, yeah, so there shouldn't
be. But it would have been doing that 2 months ago.
Yeah,
when we went through and, you know, you had me go into the control box and switch those two lines that were reversed.
Yeah.
Which was what? Proc switch were wired in the backwards or something.
Yeah, the 2 was wired to the 1, the 1 was wired to the 2.
Right. And so when we switched that, and then I went back through and found home again and did all that stuff and set it up, I think that I set it up more accurately this time than I did the first time. Mm-hmm. And I would feel pretty sure that's the case. You know, I think I took it as like close enough the first time, and close enough isn't close enough.
Yeah. It's easy to get just a little bit sort of complacent. Yeah, well, it's good enough. It'll be you know, it's just,
you know, it's like you always say, we're not making artificial heart valves. I'm not looking for, you know, 100,000th decimal place accuracy, but I do want woodworking joints to close tightly.
Sure.
And I don't want to see any kind of slop or gap in them. And some of the stuff I do, I'm trying to adapt, you know, like Japanese hand cut joinery for the ShopBot.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're hand cutting like that, you can take the time and be meticulous about how things fit. But it takes a lot of time to do that. And you know, on a job like this, you can't make any money if you're doing it that way.
Sure.
So I'm sort of adapting some of those types of things that I've done where, you know, say you've got a part here and something else needs to slot here, and then something else goes through that, you know, that creates this very strong sort of visual joint. I do a lot of that kind of thing, and it's difficult to cut by hand. It's really challenging. And so, you know, if any of that kind of stuff is off at all, you might as well not do it.
Right.
You're better off just you know, but with a butt joint and a screw,
Yes.
looks better than a badly cut fancy joint.
Get the air nailer out.
So, you know, you can cut something 90 degrees with a chop saw and put a screw in there, and it's tight. And I honestly believe people would rather see that than to see, you know, look at Mr. Fancy Pants over here trying to cut this joint, but he's butchered it up and it looks awful.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I went to see a big conference table recently that this company wanted me to see because they liked it. I went in and looking at this thing, it had, you know, the little bishop keys or the butterfly joints.
Yeah.
Keeping a crack closed, and they had, you know, rounded corners with a sharp cut butterfly just kind of wedged down in there. And you know, in places you could clearly tell it was done with one of those little pattern, you know, router pattern jigs, but it was so sloppy that, you know, part of the butterfly was sort of smashed as it was put in, and then other places there was an 1/8 of an inch gap. And, you know, I walked in and looked at it and I was just like, oh, this is not great work. You know, tabletops weren't sanded well, joints weren't fitting tightly. And then the best part was underneath the table, there were some places where these, you know, sort of big stretcher pieces are holding the table up. And it was like, whoever made it cut this joint, you know, this like a some sort of a saddle joint, right? Where something's completely slotting over another, but it was so loose, you couldn't get it to glue up. So they just ran a bunch of screws through it. It was just like, oh, it's just embarrassing, you know? So.
And then he said, nobody will crawl.
I'd rather see somebody just be honest about it and say, you know, it's just a butt joint with a screw in it, and it looks good and it's tight. And
throw some pocket screws in it; it'll be good.
So anyway, well, Bill, thanks for the answers. I hope Ernest gets what he's looking for in this offset stuff. I don't know if we've just rambled on and made it more complicated.
Probably. If I had to guess, we'll check with Ernest, see what he says. Say, did that answer your question? If it didn't, keep our feet to the fire and say, you know, tell us it didn't make sense and clarify.
Yeah.
But I think part of the thing is making sure that what you can do is repeatable. That you're set up, no matter how you do it, is you got a system so that if you drill a hole and come back tomorrow and go to the same location, that the bit will drop down in the hole. That there's not any, and that sort of you'll slop will show up in change direction. You know, there's always a little hesitation on either end if there's slop, and it'll think it's moving before it actually moves. So if you get things that end up like holes end up being oblong, it'll be because of that. It'll sort of not quite turn. They may be this way depending on where the slop is. But if you get ovals instead of circles, and that's a good test to do. And then, you know, get a set of digital calipers and measure. You want to kind of measure it more accuracy than you ever really need. and then you'll know. You know, you can, if you can get it to better than you'll need, then you're golden.
Okay. Cool.
Cool, man.
Well, have a good afternoon, Bill.
Man, I've got the big door open, and I got all the fans going.
Man, we're doing the same thing. It's hot.
I'm
hot.
through the day.
I'm so ready for this heat to be over.
Yeah. Yeah, the forecast is like upper 80s all this week and rain every day. We had one terrible rainstorm day before yesterday. Rained 2 inches in an hour and a half. But it didn't rain anywhere 5 miles away from here. It was just a little storm came up over the beach and sat on top of us and just poured and then went away. And then it just turned into steam.
Right.
So I'll be glad when this is over. I'm tired of weather in general. I don't want to be hot. I don't want to be cold. I don't want to be anything.
I know.
I want this place to turn.
It's sort of been one of those years, Bill.
I want it to turn into San Diego. I just don't want it to ever change. About a 3-degree temperature range throughout the year. All right, bud. Have a good day.
Right, man.
Take
Talk
care.
to you soon.
Bye.